Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. It's a drizzly, dreary, yucky, wet day here in the United Kingdom, so I thought I'd brighten things up by sharing with you my Goddess Beaded Cabochon Pendant design. So I've called it the Goddess Beaded Cabochon because it kind of reminded me of a goddess weave when you intersperse two strands of beads with jump rings to create that lovely kind of diagonal pattern on a bracelet usually. So let's head down to the board, take a closer look, and then we'll make this project together. So here's a slightly closer look at the design. We're going to create a form of bezel to sit over the outer surface of a cabochon. In this case I'm using round cabs, but you could adapt the design to create a different shaped pendant if you desire. I've added a little spiral on the back just to hold the cabochon safely in position on the rear, but you could use whatever technique you prefer to keep that nice and safe. I've also added some beads into that bail, an oversized bail, a bit of a trademark of mine. And I've got a gorgeous Maligano Jasper from Indonesia in my sample piece, which I'll pop up into the corner. And then I'm going to be working with this outstanding Aurora Labradorite. It's a spectrolite, and that's a really huge cabochon with lots of fire, which obviously is an absolute joy. So that's what we're going to be working with. In terms of beads, I'm going to be using some Miyuki 6/0s. These measure 3 by 4 millimeters, and you could use really any rondelles or rounds of your choice, but these work exceptionally well, and that's a 6/0. These are Miyuki with that lovely sort of titanium colour over the top. I love Miyuki beads because they are all so very even. You don't kind of tend to get the odd little misfires. They're absolutely beautiful. So I'm going to be using around about 40 of those in my project without the beading on the neckline section. But that is a very large cabochon, so you may not even need 40 of them. So just have at least 40 to hand, and I'm sure we'll manage to get through it. In terms of materials, I'm going to be working with a couple of gauges of wire. We're going to be using some 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire, and we're also going to be adding in some finer gauge. I've got it bagged up so it doesn't unspool itself everywhere, and I'm going to be using a silver colour 0.426 gauge. Now for a design like this with a really large round cab, I would suggest you'd need to start with around about 12 inches of that 1.25mm 16 gauge wire, and you'll need 2 of those the same length. Now I'm just going to be demonstrating with short pieces of wire to start the weave before we move on to the next stage, because I don't wish to be wasteful. But if you have a very tiny cabochon, you can size that down, but I'm going to be working with 2 12-inch lengths of 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire. So the first thing that we will do is just smooth and warm that wire through. Imagine, please, if you will, that these are long lengths of wire. And I'm going to begin by putting a small loop at one end. Now this isn't part of the design, it merely stops the beads from sliding off. So let's add on, just for example's sake, we're going to add on 3 beads to each side. For my demonstration piece, I used, I think, probably 16 or 17 beads on each strand, but I'm going to demonstrate with just 3 to get us going. Once you've loaded up the maximum amount of beads you think you'll need, you can always unfurl the loop we're about to create and slide the beads off, or indeed add a few more if you need to. But just to make the weave itself easier, we're going to put a loop on either end, and you'll need 2 of those. So let's say that I have 2 12-inch lengths of that heavier wire, and I've preloaded with beads. So I would say probably for this large circular cabochon, let me just give that a quick measure. That's 1 3/4 inches or 43 approximately millimeters across. So it's quite a large piece. So I've preloaded onto my design that I'm going to be working with in a moment 20 beads onto each of these lengths of wire. But what I want to do for you today is demonstrate the weave before we move on. Now I have a spool of silver coloured copper core wire. It's 0.4mm or 26 gauge, And I've popped that in a bag and unspooled about 20 inches or so just to work with to begin with. And the reason I work from the reel on a design like this is it's really difficult to estimate exactly how much wire you need, and it's kind of sad if you run out because it means you have to add on. Now, whilst it is possible to add on wire because I'm going to wrap 5 times between each bead, it means that you could perhaps identify that join. So let's not take that risk. The next thing that you need to do is estimate how much of your wire you will need to go around your cabochon. So what you can do is just kind of run your cab along the length of wire and imagine where you will need to make a start to ensure that you cover around about 80% of the edge of your cabochon. And I went for the same number of beads on either side, but if you wanted to, you could add an extra bead onto one of those and use it as the rear of our 2 bezel wires, and in that way you'll have a more symmetrical fit. I couldn't get my head around it, so I went for the same number of beads on both sides, but you could add 21 beads on the rear and then you'd have a symmetrical fit there. I could have added that on at the last minute, but honestly, I didn't think of it. So let's imagine, if we can, that we're going to fill the central section of our wire with those 3 little sample beads. And we're going to do that by wrapping around 5 times with that lighter wire on one of those strands of heavier wire. Now, you'll probably want to protect your fingers a little bit more than I do and just get that nice and smooth at the end with a pair of pliers. Scooch that round. Now, I think I've only got 4 wraps, so let's just give that a quick twizzle. And I've now got my 5th wrap in place. Please remember that you can cut off these end loops, so it doesn't really matter if they're a bit ugly or not entirely perfect. So what we're going to do now is just flip this upside down and bring the first bead over that is on the side that we're working. The next thing that we're going to do is the only slightly tricky part, and that is holding the second wire in position at a place where you imagine those beads won't be able to get past each other but won't put too much pressure on each other. So if I just pinch that together and just push those beads up really close, they're just touching. So what I'm going to do is wrap 5 times around the second strong wire. Let's move those beads back out of the way. Now, what I need to do now is ensure that I don't close this gap up. So I'm going to pinch really firmly and then continue to wrap 5 times on that second heavy gauge of wire. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm just showing you a small sample of weaving on these little stunt pieces of wire because I don't want to be wasteful. So we've got 1 wrap on either side at this moment, and then we're going to start adding the first bead in. So this is like playing with an abacus when I was a small child. So let's pull the first bead over on the lowest of our 2 wires. Bring the weaving wire back up into position. Now, this is a figure of 8 design, so it comes across the top of the lowest wire, goes underneath the upper wire, wraps around 5 times, comes back over the top, down the centre and underneath the lowest wire. So they're always switching direction. If I just tilt that like so, it's really dingy. I have all the lights in the house or in this room on to illuminate as best as I can. But the wires are switching from one side to the other in a diagonal orientation. So let's wrap 5 times now around that lower wire. Bring that around. That's 2, 3. Again, I'm very forcefully holding these 2 wires. You could use a ring clamp if you prefer, or a bulldog clip, but that might actually mark your wire a little bit too much. So a ring clamp is ideal. That's a 4th wrap and a 5th wrap, bringing that tail of wire down the centre. And then we're going to just pull the beads back out of the way. You can see at the moment we have 1 bead captured on the lower wire and a single wrap on the upper wire. So let's bring in our first bead on that upper wire. The weaving wire, has come down the centre, underneath that upper wire, and you can just gently prise those apart if you need to. So we're going to wrap 5 times now around the upper wire. Once you get into the rhythm, it's a really lovely weave and you don't have to think too hard. The only thing that I tend to do wrong when I came up with this weave is I forget that I am going on diagonals between the 2 heavy frame wires. So as long as you keep that in mind, your weave will look beautiful. So let's just scooch those beads back out of the way. My next bead is actually just casually dropped down into position already. So what we're looking for is a wrap of 5 wires, fine wires on the heavier wire again. All the way around, that's once, that's twice, 3 times, down the centre again, 4 times and 5 times. Scooch those wires into position. We're looking for nice, neat, tidy wraps. And again, my next adjacent bead has just slid into position. I think it's because I'm holding it slightly at an angle. So as long as you've got a wrap, a bead on either side, and you're running at diagonals, exactly the same as you would with any figure of 8 weave, it is going to work. So make sure that you try to keep those 2 heavy gauge wires, like tram lines, like train tracks, an equal distance apart, and your finished product will look a little bit closer to a machined product. Now obviously we're making handcrafted jewellery, so some deviation is inevitable, and don't fret if that happens. Let's wrap 5 times around that upper wire. 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Another thrilling instalment of counting with gem. Now I can see that that's a little bit tighter together than I want it to be, so just slide those beads out of the way. And you can reverse action your pliers a little bit. Can you see what I'm doing? I'm just gently opening those out, and it brings those wires just a little bit further apart. So I'm going to finish with 5 wraps on the lower wire. Let's go 1 and 2 and 3. Every time I wrap, I'm just pushing that down against the bead. 4 and 5. So this is my last wrap on the lower of those 2 heavy gauge wires. You could just open that out if you're seeing the same thing that I am, which is that they're a little bit close. So we're going to finish with 5 wraps on the upper wire as well, pinching that firmly into position to make sure that it doesn't move too much. 4 and 5 until we have finished. So scooch those up neatly. And then we're going to trim away the wire. Before you actually do trim away the wire, what you can do is kind of estimate if you have enough to go around about 80 to 85% of the circumference of your cabochon. So if you make this the first time with a round cab, it'll make your life a bit easier because you can do some maths if you wanted to. You can take that diameter, times it by 3.14 and then multiply that by 0.8 to get 80% of the distance, and that will give you an idea of what kind of woven distance you'll need. Once you have that 80 to 85% distance covered, trim that wire away, get your finer gauge wire out of the way, and then just make sure that that last little bit is cleanly, smoothly wrapped around. And then you can assess whether you're happy with the parallelness, don't think that's a word, of your goddess inspired weave. So I've created an extra long goddess beaded weave. These started out at 12 inches of that 1.25 or 16 gauge wire, and I added in 20 beads on either side. Thinking about it, I could have gone for 21 on the far side and it would look really beautiful with that extra bead around the rear side of that faux bezel strip. So there's something to consider, something that I've learned from myself by making a mistake. So let's head back down to the board and start fitting this around the face of our cabochon. So I've actually just taken a few minutes to recreate the piece that I had ready, and I've added that extra bead on one end. I've finished either side of that goddess beaded weave with a single wrap of 5 turns on either end, so the whole thing is completed. I've centralised it on those 2 12-inch lengths, and I'm just going to trim away the excess. Just that little bit of a bend that we put on the end, just to hold our beads in position. You could straighten that out if it's easier for you. I'm just going to trim those away quickly. So what we're looking to do is to create a round form that circles with the larger number of beads sitting at the back and the smaller number of beads. There's only one bead difference. I ended up actually using, I think, 24 on the rearmost and 23 on the front wire. And that's to fit this huge cabochon. So what we're going to do is to start by forming into a circular shape so that we can add that to our cabochon. Now I have got a bead pot, which I'm just going to find, which is larger than the cabochon, and that's where I'm going to start. We're going to need to move gently because I don't want to shock the wire and I don't want to harm my beads. So I'm just going to put a little bit of warmth into the design. Now normally if we're working with bare wire, we could just pass thumb and forefinger over the surface like so, and that will warm it completely, or certainly enough to allow us to manoeuvre that wire safely. But what we're going to need to do is just put a little bit of warmth into that central section just by pressing and moving around. So what we shall do now is I'll put the larger number lower down and start drawing very, very softly and gently around that form that I'm using. You might have a mandrel or something that is just the right size, but I'm definitely going to start with a larger shape than I need, and that will spring out again, so you'll be able to see at least the beginnings of what we're going to do. If I pop that cabochon into position, you can see that we obviously need to now reduce that shape slightly. So I have a strip pot here, which I'm going to use now to just draw that size down. Now the strip pot is much smaller than the cabochon in question, so I'm not going to completely encircle that pot with my beaded segment. I'm going to use sections or little arcs on that circular form just to draw the wires a little bit closer together. Don't worry about what they're doing just here for the moment. We can sort that out in a little while. So just bringing that around until we get closer to the form that we need. That's almost small enough. So again, just very, very gently pressing onto that round form. We don't want to do anything too quickly or too sharply. And we do certainly want to work with warmed wire if at all possible. So I've gone for around about 85% coverage around that circumference. So let's just have a look, sit that cab into position and take a look at what we're getting to. That's almost there, to be honest. So in order to keep our cabochon safe and to not allow it to pop out forwards, if I push from the rear, you'll see that this is completely safe. It's not going to come through the front. So what we're going to do is to bring the front row of beads forwards. The way we're going to do that, to make it smaller, so we're just going to push with our thumbs over the top whilst retaining that shape and size on the rearmost strip of wire. So you can just push that gently and it will spring out slightly so it comes a little bit larger again. But you can see what we're achieving is that you can now see the rearmost section of beaded wire is larger. The frontmost section is smaller, and in terms of size, what we're looking for is to have that rearmost section of wire sit around the outside circumference of the cab. But when we flip that over, we want the frontmost wire with the fewer number of beads on, we want that to be smaller. We need that to be smaller than the front surface of the cabochon. So what we're going to do with these wires here is quite structural. The rearmost wires we're going to turn upright to create a bail, and the frontmost wires we're going to cross around to secure that circular form. What we need to do in wear is to make sure that that cabochon can't pop forwards. But when you have a cab that's as beautiful as this gorgeous Spectrolite or this Maligano Jasper, what we're looking to do is to cover as little as possible, but equally we don't want to drop it on the floor and smash it and see it gone forever. So we will now just go to the rear of the design and turn each of these lines of wire that we have available upright. Let's just do that either side of the last couple of wraps of wire. And this is going to become our bail. So in a moment we shall weave this together, and you can do that with beads or without beads, whichever way you prefer. I might do this one without beads, but you can see that all I've done is a similar wrap, a similar weave with beads on that bail section. So in a second we'll weave that together in a figure of 8 weave so that it matches into the aesthetic of the design. And once we've woven that first section, we'll tie the front wires, these 2 wires, all the way around. So in order to bring these 2 straight lines together, we're just going to go back to our little bag of that finer gauge wire. This is 0.4mm or 26 gauge. I'm using a silver colour because hopefully it will make it easier to see what's happening on the screen. And I'm going to leave that on the reel inside the bag and just unspool maybe about 12 inches or so. It's getting a bit kinked in there, but I'm not going to overly worry about it. And I'm just going to show you how to start this weave off, and then I will complete the rest of that off camera. Now normally I would do 3 on one side, go down the centre, 3 on the other side, bring that back in opposition, but because I've got 5 wraps between each bead, I think today I might go for 5 weaves, sorry, I beg your pardon, 5 wraps on either side. So if I go around 3 times, that will give me an opportunity to just use that last little tail of wire, get that tucked away as neatly as possible, and then we'll scooch that down all the way to the beaded section on our pendant. So what we're looking to do is to just make sure that that last little bit is nice and neat and tidy, and I very much prefer to have that inside. So I'm looking to just rotate that little coil around until the cut end sits inside the frame, and in that way it's less likely to interact with anything. So let's just draw those 2 upright wires together and make sure that we'll be able to get our cabochon in at the back. We will indeed. We'll be able to tighten up the front in just a moment. So let's draw that away from the base for just a second, and it's just a classic figure of 8 weave. 5 wraps on the lower wire as you're looking at it. The wire comes off the top of the lower wire down the centre, and then underneath the upper wire, 5 wraps on the upper wire, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Make sure those wraps are nice and neat and tidy. Push that all the way down to the base. All you're going to do is continue in that same weave for maybe 1 3/4 inches, depends on how big you want your bail to be, and I'll meet you back here in a second when that's done. So I've completed a full 2 inches of that 5 and 5 figure of 8 or basket weave, just in a straight line up at that 12 o'clock position. And I'll show you now how you can secure the front. I will drop a card in just now to tell you about the Beaded Loki Bail, which is an alternative way of finishing off the pendant. And I'll also show you how to create a basic bail with this basket weave in just a second. So the key to a successful design like this is to always continuously ensure that your cab fits in, that you're making that front line a little bit smaller so that it safely captures your cabochon, and there's no chance of that going through. So there are 2 parts now left for us to do. The first one is actually the most important. What we're going to do is to tie these 2 little side wires just around the frame. It's a very simple and clean design that we're going to use, but what we need to do is to ensure that that front circle is as small as humanly possible so that your cab doesn't escape. So what we will do is just warm through these tails, and we can lose quite a lot of this wire because, as I mentioned, I want to keep this quite small and tidy. You could, if you wanted to, take these wires all the way around the neckline and add some flourishes or coils or something a little bit more woven if you desire. But what I'm going to do is a very, very simple and clean project. So if I just flip this over to the rear, what we're looking to do is just to create a small gap for these wires to come around and just fit into. So if I pull this little bit of weaving apart, you see that we can find a bit of bare wire here, and we can find a bit of bare wire here. Now the wire that is shown on your left at the moment is closest to where I am. If I just flip that sideways, the one that's just coming up here on the right of the screen is more forwards, further away from me. So I'm going to start with this one because it's closest, and I'm going to trim that wire now to about 1.5 inches. Let's pop that in the scrap pot for later. And what we're looking to do is to make a little hook for this tail of wire to fit into this teeny tiny gap. Now, if you want to wrap that around twice, you absolutely can. But in order for it to be a nice clean design, again, I'm just going to pull that front section that was furthest away from us at the moment and make sure it's as tight as it possibly can be before I create a right angle bend. And I've just drawn that wire around the neckline section. I'll do the same on the other side, I think, actually, just to keep it as a placeholder for now. Make sure that's as tight as it can be. Pull the wire up. We might as well just trim that tail away as well into the scrap pot. Let's just pop this over to the front so we can see once we tie these two little wires away, that will be good and solid and safe. It's quite an elegant and simple, just little crossover at the top. So you could, if you wanted to, wrap that around twice, as I say, but I'm going to keep this as simple and clean as possible and just as minimally functional. So let me just put my nail under there so you can see the light shining on that wire. All I'm looking to do is to cut the wire and bring it back to the rear side of itself. So you only need quite a short amount. So let's trim that further away now we've had a chance to look. You can see that's quite a short amount of wire. If I do the same on the far side, just make that gap in the frame more visible, and I'll trim away on the second side as well. You really don't need a huge amount of wire, but I always like to have more wire than I need, because at this stage you might prefer to keep those wires long and use it to create a great big woven flourish around the edge. But what we're going to do is very, very simply just turn a little hook shape on the back here. And just bring that up into the light very, very gently, a little bit at a time. I'm just going to ensure that this wire turns back and hits the rear side of itself. So if I do the same on the other side, I'm going to have to do this opposite handed. I normally would work with the bend of my pliers going in the opposite direction. But just to get access and visibility, I could even take a teeny tiny bit extra off the end there. Always look twice and then cut once, and then hopefully there won't be any tears. And then what we're looking to do is just tuck this down as tight as possible to the rear side of the design. So it can't be seen from the front, but there's enough wire for it to be completely functional. Now I've tucked that really, really firmly, and I'll do the same on this side. Just push that down so that from the front you can't see those cut ends. So you might need to just pop your pliers in once you're looking from the front and make sure that you're happy with how that sits. Another thing you'll need to do is just straighten up the neckline that we're going to turn into a bail. So you might need to just twist the wire because these come through, one is on top of the other, and that will pull the rear side out of true. So just bring that back round into a smooth straight line. Now there are a multitude of ways in which you can finish off a bail. As I mentioned earlier, I've got my Beaded Loki Bail tutorial, which is additional to a design I did last year, and I've already linked that in the video description so that you can take a look at that if you want to have that beaded Loki finish instead of a woven finish. But I'm going to show you a very simple way of finishing 2 inches of weaving. Now because my wires, my tramline wires, got a little bit wider, normally I would bring this woven section forwards and then wrap around to the back. But because it's slightly wider to the end, I'm actually going to bring this backwards instead. And you'll notice there's a tiny little gap. It's about 3 or 4 millimeters between the beaded section and where I make that angle. It's about 45 degrees from that upright. And the reason I'm pushing it backwards instead of forwards is because it means that that slightly wider piece of weaving will be visible at the front. What we're going to do now is put a little bit of extra warmth into that design and grab ourselves a round form. So I think I'm just going to grab a pen for today. When you're working with weaving like this, what can happen if you use bail makers is if you accidentally put a little bit too much pressure on that weave with your bail makers, you can separate that weave out slightly, and we want that to stay nice and compact. So I'm going to wrap this around a pen. I've actually just misplaced about 5 minutes ago my wooden dowels, which would have been perfect. But what I'm going to do is draw that over the front so that the end of my weave meets just in front of that angle change that we made. Now the simplest thing that you can do is exactly as we did a moment ago, post these 2 wires through the gap and tuck very, very neatly. However, for me today, I think I'm going to do one of my classic bails, which is to turn the wires out sideways, push, compress that weave as much as possible, so that both of those wires have gone out at an angle. I will bring that pen back in for just a second to make sure that when I draw this into its final position, that I'm keeping a nice straight line on that bail. It's very easy to get one of these wires slightly higher than the other. It is usually fixable after you've tied everything together, but it's a little bit easier if you don't tie it together and make it wonky. So I'm going to leave my marker pen in possession for a moment, and I'm just going to warm these tail wires through. Now, bearing in mind these wires have been through a bit of action, they're starting to get a little bit firmer. Also, it's a heavier gauge wire than I often use, a 1mm, so this is a 1.25 or 16 gauge, so it's a little bit firmer to work with. So trying to keep that nice and even in that bail shape is kind of key. Now, one of these needs to be just slightly higher, so I'm just going to push that up and out of the way, and then I'm going to draw the other side all the way around the back of that neck section as tightly as I can and back over the front. Now you can turn this into a coil and sit it down over that top neck section if you don't want to see that crossover, or you can bring it around to the back and just trim it away really neatly. What I think I might do is just turn that into a coil to sit on the rear of the design, but leave it sticking up. So let's grab some round pliers. Let's turn that around to start on a coil and then flip that over. Might need to just tighten that up slightly. And I'm going to create a coil, but I'm going to leave it sticking up at a jaunty angle because we're going to need to put our cabochon into position in just a moment. So I'm just going to leave that sticking up at a funny angle for now. And then we'll need to bring that second wire all the way around as well. And I think this one I'll leave at the front, but I will go for another little coil. They're already flush cut. Just need to tighten those lines up. So give that a squish so that one doesn't sit on top of the other, they sit side by side. So you can see they're sitting, nestling neatly. And we'll go for another little coil, which I'll just leave sticking up for a moment. And we could stick it over the front of that bail, or indeed bring it down over the pendant in a moment. We will get to that in just a second. Very, very carefully, trying to keep that little wrap that we've done around the neck of the bail as tight and clean as possible. And you've now got a coil on either side, just sticking out at a jaunty angle for now. And that should have set our bail really nicely. So that's one of my favourite bail designs to make. It's very, very strong. And it's nice and neat and tidy. You don't have to have the flourishes if you don't want to. You can simply bring the wires to the back, cut them off and push the ends inside that little angle change section. Or you can use the same technique as we did with that front wire, which is just sitting around the frame as small as possible. So in a second, what we will do is have a look at the different ways you can create a safe rear for that design. So for the last section of today's video, we're going to fit that cabochon securely. Now there are a couple of different ways that you can put a back onto a cabochon like this, and I will show you just a couple of examples in a moment, but let's get together down at the board and fit a little spiral to the rear of this design. So let's get our cabochon set firmly and safely inside our Goddess Beaded Cabochon Pendant design. Again, I would stress that you cannot check too many times to ensure that this sits safely. You can see that it's slightly elevated at the rear of the design, but that the rear line of beads sits around the total circumference and that the front set of beads sit inside. And that means that from the front, that will be nice and safe. On the design I've already prepared for today's tutorial, I've created a double spiral, just spiraling out and then a little bit of a loop at one end. It looks a bit messy, so I'll probably take this apart and redo it, but the main thing is that it's good and safe. As an alternative to that finishing, you can simply run a length of 0.4 or 26 gauge wire point to point over the back of the cabochon just to net that into position, and that will keep it safe. So you have options with how you can sit this. But what I'm going to do is show you this technique, but hopefully a little bit neater. As I say, I'll probably take that one apart. So let's have our wire to begin with. We have around about 11 inches or so of 1.25mm 16 gauge wire. And I'm going to start by creating a spiral from one end. So let's take some round pliers, or my little friendly memory wire pliers. Begin with a loop that goes all the way around. Now, in order for this to not catch on things, it's kind of sensible if you can get that cut end to sit inside that first spiral, and then just allow that wire to lazily circle around until you have a gorgeous spiral to work with. Now, I didn't have a huge amount of wire available to me when I made that example, which is one of the reasons it's not as pretty as it could be. So what I'm going to do is simply create a spiral to begin with, and I'm just putting a little bit of tension with both hands as I bring that wire all the way around, trying to keep a reasonably similar gap in between those passes of wire. However, in a moment I'm going to pull this open and just bring that slightly wider apart in certain places. So it doesn't really matter if it's not perfect, because you can indeed adjust that in a moment or two. So once we get towards the end of that 11 or so inches of that heavier gauge wire, we're going to just draw that around for the last time and then put a small loop on the other end. Now, you don't have to put that small loop on, but I don't like having a cut bit of wire just hanging around. So I'm going to turn that over, bring that to, again, have the cut end touching the next section of wire as it comes around. Give that a flatten down, and then I'm going to push that so that it extends out from that spiral. Now, once we've created this spiral, we're definitely going to have to play with it. It's not quite large enough. So what I need this piece of wire to do is to extend, for the most part, just around the outside of the back of the cabochon. So you will need to just play with it slightly until that sits exactly how you need it to. We could turn that loop over the other way if it makes you happier aesthetically. Just need it to sit so that it will reach all the way around the outside for about 2/3 of that spiral. You could use a mandrel form to help you get a perfect circle if you want to, but I'm aware that my cabochon isn't a perfect circle anyway, so I'm just going to keep opening that out by hand. Now, that's pretty much 2/3 to 3/4 of the cabochon has the wire passing around, again, the outside of the cab, not on the back but around the outside. So once I've got that set in my mind and I'm happy with that shape and form, what I might do is just give that a little bit of strengthening so that I manage to retain that. You could gently hammer this section, just that 2/3 that goes around the outside. What we're looking to do is retain that shape and size, because in a moment we'll be pulling the rest of that spiral a little bit more open so that it sits centrally, or however you want it to sit. You don't have to do a spiral. You could go for a corset weave if you want to. Whatever makes you happy to keep that rear side nice and safe. That looks pretty decent to me. Again, just to reiterate that about 2/3 of this wire is sitting around the outside of the cabochon, and that's because I want to ensure that it's completely safe. We're now going to add in some lighter wire. I've got around about 18 inches of that 0.4mm gauge 26 gauge wire. I'm using silver medium temper, and I'm just going to attach that around the outside of my spiral to begin with. So I'm going to go for 3 wraps around the spiral section. just going to scooch that up so it's nice and neat and tidy. And all we're going to do from here on in is attach this to the frame at random points. Now I'm only going to go for one pass of wire when I'm attaching to the frame because I don't want to disrupt that pattern overly much. So I'm going to bring one tail of that wire, and I started in the middle. You don't have to, you can start at one end if you want to. And I'm just going to pass that inside the outermost layer of those beads. So if I post that down and just draw it into position, we just need to have somewhere to start. So that needs to be reasonably adjacent. We've got one attachment. I've just circled once around that rear wood frame. Make sure that your cab goes in still. And then it's just a case of weaving from point to point. So I'm going to draw the wire firmly back up. Again, I've just gone once around that outer frame wire. Let's bring this out to the side. And because I want to reflect the figure of 8 weave that we did, because the wire's coming around the outside over the top, I'm going to take it underneath the outside of that spiral. Now that's attention to detail that you don't need to worry about if you don't want to, but I kind of like doing that. So I'm just going to pull that nice and firmly. What I'll then do is wrap 3 times around our spiral or our back plate, and it doesn't need to be really super tight until you get that 3rd wrap in position. If it's a little bit baggy, you can simply move it further away to give you that tension that you need. Now let's tighten those wraps up. What I'm going to do here is take the end of my finer gauge wire down inside the outermost section of beads, and again pull that up and tight. Now you will need to at this point begin to get some tension into the design. I'm looking to have 2/3 of my outermost spiral just on the outside rear margin of that cabochon, and we're forming a strong connection now between the frame and that rear back plate. So again, the wire that's in my hand, the fine wire, has come over the top, so I want to pop that underneath the spiral. So we're just repeating the same pattern of that figure of 8 weave, albeit in a rather eccentric fashion right now. So all you will need to do is continue around until you get to the loop section. We should have enough wire to get to there, and then I'll tie off 3 times around the spiral section. When we've gone around the other direction, you may like to add some further wraps in between the outermost section of spiral and the next inside piece. So I'll show you an example of what I mean. Just across the back of that Maligano Jasper, I've got some additional wraps, 3 and 3, again figure of 8 weave, so underneath one, over the top of the other. If I had been thinking straight, I would have gone all the way around. I would have started with more wire. So I will probably redo this one in the next day or so. But I'm just going to show you the basics of that design right now, which is to figure of 8 weave all the way around the outside. So we're connecting the frame to the back plate, all the way around in the opposite direction, frame to back plate. You may need to add in extra wire, and then you'll go from the outermost pass of that spiral to the next one in, just to add some extra strength and decoration, and you can make it a darn sight prettier than that. I'm definitely going to redo that. That is how to create your own goddess beaded cabochon pendant and safely house the most beautiful cabochons with beads. That's what the rears look like when they're finished. This is a very simple point-to-point weave, but perfectly adequate to keep that lovely Labradorite in position. That's with a non-beaded Loki Bail. And then you've got this beautiful Aurora Spectrolite Labradorite set with that goddess beaded cabochon design. And then on the rear we've got the spiral. And I just thought I'd show you what it looked like if you actually do a neat job with that finer gauge wire just finishing off. And I used 2 lengths of wire, and they were about sort of 18 to 20 inches each. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed creating these with me today. I've certainly enjoyed the process and learned a little bit as I've gone through. Have yourself a beautiful day. If you're liking the content, please do subscribe to the channel, drop a like on the video. It really does help us to get seen by the wider community. Have a beautiful day, and I'll see you very, very soon. I'm Gem Hawks. Bye for now.